Hey guys, Josh here at Crafted Beer Videos, and today we're going to discuss how to talk about beer. So there are four different aspects you can really kind of focus on when talking about beer. It is the appearance, the smell, the mouthfeel, and the taste. While not everyone's going to be talking professionally or writing beer reviews or anything about beer, I find it is also good to kind of approach your tasting when you're drinking a beer to taste it around these kind of four concepts as well. They can open up kind of how you think about the beer, give you kind of some idea of what to expect, and then help you kind of develop those taste words as well. So the first thing we're going to talk about is appearance. So there's kind of three different things that I look at when I am looking at a beer to kind of figure out what to expect. So the first thing is going to be the color, and obviously that is the color of the beer. The lighter it is means they've used a lighter malt, so that's going to give you some lighter, breadier flavors. Something like this, I'm going to expect kind of white bread or water cracker. You know, there's really kind of not flavorless, but very lightly flavored crackers that go great with cheese. Kind of biscuity almost, kind of like that dry malt flavor I would expect from something this color. As you get more into the ambers, you expect those kind of more crusty flavors or kind of like caramelized flavors, and then as you get darker you get more roasty. You can even get chocolatey or coffee notes as well. For people who do like homebrew competitions, either from the brewing side or judging side, they have what's called SRM, and that is just a scale of numbers that are assigned to color. So if I were submitting a pale ale, I would have a range. I think pale ales are like 6 to 9, something like that. I don't judge and I don't brew, so I don't have those memorized. But yeah, like 6 to 9 would be the range that the brewer would be trying to hit when he's brewing, and that's what the judge would be holding accountable for that pale ale. As someone who's just drinking beer at home for their own enjoyment, that is not super important, but I wanted to toss it out there so you'll kind of have an idea of that type of stuff. Yeah, like I was saying with the color, I like to think about what the bread would taste like if it was that color. That's kind of the easiest way to figure out what to expect from that. Another thing with appearance you can talk about is clarity. And you can see, you can see how clear. This is a pretty clear beer. Got a little bit, oh no, that's more my glass just condensating. This is a Helles, so I would expect it to be pretty crystal clear, or as the brewers would say, bright. This is a very bright beer. You can see through it very well. There are some styles, like a Hefeweizen or a New England IPA or Hazy IPA, that you would expect to be opaque, because they have a bunch of sediment or oils or proteins floating in the beer. Flavor-wise, that doesn't tell you a whole lot. I guess if you're talking IPAs, I would expect a different flavor from a hazy IPA than a bright IPA. But that's just more styles, using the how hazy it is to determine what the style is. Actual brewing techniques don't really change much. I've had unfiltered pilsners that taste just as clean as a filtered pilsner. So that doesn't really help you much, but it's a good thing to talk about. And then finally, head and head retention is another thing you talk about with appearance. So this is having some pretty good head retention. It's a little on the hoppier side for a typical Helles, which is why I like this one. Just gives it a little bit drier, a little crisper mouthfeel. So the hop oils are what can make that head retention. The other thing hop oils do is what's called lacing. And you can see as I kind of tilt it, this one's doing it a little bit, making that really pretty lace. What's cool about hoppy beers, super hoppy beers, is as you drink, you'll see lines going down for like where you took sips. Let's see if I can get one here. Yeah, so that's staying, which is awesome. And assuming that you have a clean glass, which we'll talk about when we talk about glassware, you can get some really good lacing going down the glass. Like I said, that's from the hop oils adhering to the glass, creating that nice head retention. Next thing you can talk about and kind of approach when you're tasting beer is the smell. The best way to get a good smell is you want to put your hand on top and give it a swirl so it releases all of that tastiness, but you're trapping it. And then stick your nose in there. This I get lemon, which I don't really taste, which is interesting. Lemon, and I actually usually don't, but for this beer, I get some of that biscuitiness from the malt as well. Typically, I tend to get mostly hop profile from the nose, just because there's hops that they add called aroma hops. They add them at a certain time, and they just create this great smell. And as we talked about in the last video, smell is super important for your taste, and so that's why it's important to get a good smell. Sometimes you can get some yeast notes as well, like that Hefeweizen we were talking about earlier. They use a particular yeast that produces lots of phenols and esters, which come across typically as banana and clove in the Hefeweizen, and you can get those on the nose as well. Next thing is mouthfeel. As that says, that is the feeling of the beer in your mouth. That comes from carbonation, and then residual either sugars that don't get fermented out, or proteins from the malt that stay in suspension in the beer. You can have beers that are super syrupy, so something like a high ABV Imperial Stout, very viscous. The alcohol adds some viscosity, but then also they tend to be a little bit lower carbonated and have a lot of residual sugar. So all of that creates a very syrupy mouthfeel, which is great. If you ever get the chance, get something like Brooklyn Black Chocolate or Narwhal and make a ice cream float with them. It is super decadent, and that viscosity really pairs with that ice cream really well, and is awesome. You can also get beers that are more like what I'm having here, that are very light and effervescent. This one's super carbonated, and then has very low residual sugar. It's very dry. And so that creates just a very nice dancing-like feeling on your palate, which goes great with food. A beer like this, it's not super heavily flavored. I mean, it's flavorful, but all very subtly. Goes great with pretty much any food. That carbonation helps cut through fattiness. This has a little bit of bitterness that makes it nice and drying on the palate. The only thing I wouldn't pair this with is dessert. Unless it's a savory dessert. Like if you're doing dessert cheese, this would probably go fine. But any entree or appetizer would be great with this beer because of how carbonated it is, and that mouthfeel helps cut through all that fattiness. You do get some beers that are kind of hybrids of the two. Ones that most come to mind are like Belgian ales, the Abbey styles, like a quadruple, because those are bottle conditioned, so that creates a finer bubble in the beer, finer carbonation. And then they actually add brewer's sugar, so there's extra unfermentable sugars in it as well. So you have that high carbonation, but lots of residual sugar, and that just creates fun beers. Because of that, you get kind of that dichotomy, really sweet, but nice and bubbly as well. You can also get beers that are on nitro, which nitrogen reacts differently in the beer. It doesn't dissolve the same as carbonation or CO2 does. And so when you have a nitrogenated beer, it comes across as creamier on your mouthfeel. It has finer bubbles, and they actually come out of solution faster. The last thing you can think about and talk about with beer is taste. And there's really kind of two different aspects to taste. The first is the initial taste when you first take the sip. And then the other one is the aftertaste, so what happens after you swallow. For taste, I like to try to figure out what I'm tasting in relation to other things I've eaten. So if I'm talking about the malt flavor I'm getting, I try to grab like bread words, like I was talking earlier, this is biscuity or crackery, or you can have crust or rye bread, or really any malt. I mean, it can taste like cereal. Any malt flavor or grain flavor that you've had in other foods, you can apply to beer because a lot of those same ingredients are in it. You can also get coffee and chocolate notes from the malt with the darker roasted malts. Those are good things to talk about. For hops, there's kind of three different flavor aspects that you can get with hops. So the first one is fruit. Typically it's citrus fruit, but you can also get tropical fruits and even some peach sometimes. You can get pine, like resiny notes. Those are kind of the older American hops tend to have that. You can get like piney or grassy from those. And then if you go even further back, old school, you get the German noble hops that are spicy. Not spicy as in like a chili pepper spicy, but spicy as in like white pepper or coriander a little bit, or I'm trying to just, those can come off grassy as well, and herbal. That's really more what I'm talking about, just more herbal notes. For yeast, you can get some spices like clove, like we talked about with that Hefeweizen. You can also get some really earthy notes like leather and hay. Sometimes we just talk straight funk, which I've also heard described as horse blanket. You get that kind of hay note with a little bit of like mustiness. Sounds weird, but with the right beers, it can be delicious. For aftertaste, the main things that I like to talk about is how clean the aftertaste is. So is there a lingering bitterness, or does the palate just clean, go away, get you ready for the next sip? This beer's got a little bit of lingering bitterness and actually some minerality, which is expected in a Helles. But it's not excessive. It's pretty clean. The other thing you can talk about is the retrohale, which we discussed and learned about in the last video, and that's where you, after you swallow, you breathe out through your nose, and that just opens up a lot of different flavors. That's where I tend to get a lot of really good malt flavors from the beer, and then a little bit more of the hop aroma as well. Let's see what I get on this one. Yeah, this is just really clean. I get a little bit of malt. It's more of a sweeter malt on that retrohale, which is interesting because of how much residual bitterness I was getting earlier. Very white bready almost, which is great. This is a killer Helles. So cool. That is discussing how to talk about beer. Don't forget to subscribe so you know when my next video comes out. If you have any questions you want me to talk about, put them down below and I'll get to them in the next video. That reminds me, we did have a question from the last video. Someone wrote in asking about if drinking beer helps with breastfeeding mothers with their milk production. First, I want to say I'm not a doctor, so please discuss this with your either primary care physician or your pediatrician before drinking and nursing. So there are lots of old wives' tales, you would say. A lot coming from England and Germany, which is two of the great historical brewing centers. Let's say beer helps with milk production, and a lot of it comes from ingredients in beer that are said to help with milk production. The two biggest ones being lactose, milk sugar, and oatmeal. Both of those are used kind of heavily in English styles, not as much in Germany. In England, you can find like milk stouts which have lactose, or oatmeal stouts which have oats, or you can find combinations thereof. What's cool about lactose is it is a non-fermentable sugar, so it creates this creamy sweetness, which is why it's great in the milk stout. Oatmeal kind of does the same thing without the sweetness. It's got some proteins that don't get fermented out or anything. Nothing, they stay in the beer, and so it creates just a slightly creamier mouthfeel than you would have without it. As I said, I'm not a doctor, so I do not know for sure if those actually do anything. That's just kind of the rumor, hearsay I've heard talked about. But awesome, thanks for tuning in. Our next video is going to be how to interpret beer menus and tap lists. So you kind of, now that you have an idea of what we're going to be talking about when we discuss beer, we can start applying that to some real world stuff and how to shop for beer and looking at beer labels as well. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see y'all next time.